Gospel of Luke, chapter 9, verses 1 through 50. Today our study passage is most of Luke, chapter 9. If I had to characterize this chapter overall, I would say that it represents a turning point. This is not just my opinion. Many scholars have noted that in the 24 chapters of Luke, chapter 9 is where things fundamentally change. The ministry approach of Jesus and his followers begins a new phase. Miracles expand from individuals and small groups to the masses. The 12 disciples begin to realize who their master really is, and Jesus begins to make clear who he really is. For them, their understanding of Messiah begins to evolve. The kingdom of God is not what they envisioned it would be, and the meaning of discipleship comes into greater focus. In the first 50 verses of Luke 9, we see at least 7 stories that contribute to a significant paradigm shift for all who would be Jesus' followers. The sending of the 12, the feeding of the 5,000, the declaration of Peter, the prediction of Christ's death, the transfiguration, the failure of the disciples, and the prediction of Christ's death a second time. It was back in Luke 6 where Jesus assigned 12 of his followers to be his team of disciples. At that time, Luke said, almost parenthetically, that they were also designated apostles. But nothing more was said about this. Now in chapter 9, Luke describes their first apostolic mission. Up until now, they have been Jesus' students. Now they will be his representatives. Jesus not only gives them authority to go out and tell others about the kingdom, but he also gives them the power to cast out demons and heal the sick. These are men who, until recently, were bewildered and amazed by the things Jesus was saying and doing. They would seem to be ill-equipped to go out and be God's representatives to the world, but Jesus sends them anyway, with even less equipment than they might normally take. They are to travel light and visit towns bringing nothing but the clothes they are wearing. No walking staff or bag, no food or money, no extra shirt, no arrangements for accommodations. They have to depend entirely on God's provision for them and the generosity of the people they visit for food and lodging. This is certainly an exercise in faith, the faith that seemed to be absent during the Galilean storm. Now they must trust God not only for physical provision, but for the words to say and the effectiveness of their ministry. Based on Luke's narrative, Jesus apparently does not give his men detailed instructions on how to share the good news or how to deal with ill people. He mostly tells them what not to take. The learning curve will be steep. They will be accepted or rejected by those they encounter. What happens if the disciples are rejected? They are to leave their town and dust off their feet as they leave. Dusting off one's feet or clothing was a symbolic gesture by Jews. It indicated either that they were renouncing those who had rejected them, or that they were cleaning themselves of Gentile impurity when returning from pagan territory, or both. Despite being seemingly unprepared, despite their lack of experience, despite their little faith, the disciples have a broadly successful short-term mission. Multiple villages are blessed, the good news is spread, people are healed, and even Herod the Tetrarch hears about it. Herod is perplexed. Luke assumes we already know some of the backstory. It turns out that Herod had executed John the Baptist in prison. This probably happened some months before, and the story of what happened is both gruesome and repulsive. It'll have to be left for another day. Now, some people are saying that Jesus is John raised from the dead. That would be alarming to Herod, and according to Matthew and Mark, he believes this. The Tetrarch is superstitious, believing in the Hellenistic notion that the dead will return to haunt their killers. And on top of that, he has a guilty conscience. Others are saying that Jesus is Elijah. This is not the case, and we've seen how it is that John the Baptist actually fulfilled the role of ministering in the spirit and power of Elijah. Herod asked the question that many are now wondering: who is this Jesus? From this point on, he seeks to meet Christ, but he'll have to wait. He won't see him until the day of Jesus' crucifixion. Herod won't see him soon because, for one thing, he is likely ministering near Bethsaida, which is in territory outside of Herod's jurisdiction. Jesus' miracles are starting to touch an increasing number of people, including people from areas outside of Israel. They are eager to hear what he has to say and to witness his healing. And also remember the rumors swirling around about him being a resurrected John or the awaited Elijah. Today, in a remote area, a sizable number of people listen to Christ into the late afternoon. The disciples become concerned for the welfare of the people. How will they get food and find a place to stay? Jesus surprisingly asked the disciples to provide. The disciples, who have seen the Lord still a storm, remove a legion of demons, raise a girl from the dead, and who have been sent themselves on mission empowered by Christ, focus not on the power of Jesus, but on their own minimal resources, 2 fish and 5 loaves of bread. They see the size of the need and the smallness of the human resources available. They must learn to see as Jesus sees, who recognizes the size of the need and the greatness of God's resources available. The disciples need to see that they can accomplish things they never dreamed of doing through their association with Jesus. Only the limits of their vision will prevent them from moving forward in ministry. Rather than reprimanding them again for their lack of faith, Jesus has them start doling out what they have to the more than 5,000 people there. In the process of serving, the food multiplies, and in the end, there is more than enough to feed everyone. There's a lesson here. Jesus often takes what we bring him and multiplies it. When God called Moses to Egypt to free the Israelites there, Moses hesitated. He said, "What if they don't believe me?" God said, "What's in your hand?" It was a staff, and God turned it into an instrument that parted the Red Sea. A woman lost her husband and was in financial debt. She had nothing, or so it seemed. But the prophet Elisha asked her what she did have, and it turned out to be a small jar of olive oil. Elisha told her to borrow empty jars from her neighbors, and God filled them all with oil. Pastor Wayne Ogamachi said, "When we don't feel we have enough to serve God, he asks us what we do have." Now it's Jesus' turn to ask, who is this Jesus? Only he says it a little differently. Who do you say that I am? He's directing his question to the disciples. They, more than anyone else, should come the closest to answering correctly. They mention the rumors swirling around about John and Elijah. Reincarnation was a Platonic notion that some Jews believed in, but Jesus wants to know their take on the question. Peter, often the spokesman for the group, says, "God's Messiah." Although Luke stops there and does not further elaborate on Peter's answer, we should ask ourselves what Peter really meant and what he really knew. The concept of a Messiah was widespread in Jewish thought. It was surmised from the Old Testament scriptures that a leader would one day arise who would defeat Israel's enemies and bring the nation to independence and greatness. That leader would not necessarily be divine, but he would be a king having special favor with God. This king would be politically powerful, militarily victorious, just, and holy. Now, not everyone agreed on the attributes of the Messiah, but you get the idea. When Peter had first been told by his brother Andrew that he had found the Messiah, this was probably the viewpoint held by both men. Similarly, 2 other disciples, Philip and Nathanael, saw him as the one the law and the prophets wrote about. The title Christ means anointed one, which is synonymous with the Messiah. The angels had told the shepherds who watched their flocks the night Jesus was born, identified him as the Messiah, and Luke himself calls him the Lord's Messiah in chapter 2. Demons knew Jesus was the Messiah in chapter 4. But when Peter makes his declaration in Luke 9, it is the first time that a human declares Jesus as Messiah. Problem is, Jesus does not fit the traditional profile of the Messiah. Rather than defeating enemies, he turns the other cheek. Rather than being high and lifted up, he identifies with the lowly of society. His brand of holiness seems often to conflict with sacred law and religious custom. Peter and the rest of the disciples are declaring more than they know. They do not yet realize that part of the job description of Messiah is suffering at the hands of men and death on a cross. They do not yet know that the Messiah brings salvation for all humankind and not just for Israel. They do not know that the Messiah is actually God. But they are definitely getting there. Their view of Messiah is evolving and enlarging. And that is why Peter's answer, or confession as some call it, is a pivotal event in the Gospel of Luke. In Matthew, Jesus expands on Peter's statement and promises to build and empower the church. You see, once you answer the question, who is this Jesus? The next question Jesus asks is, will you then follow me? The disciples are now at a point where Jesus can reveal his real mission on earth. It's a hard pill to swallow, but they need to start thinking rightly about the future and the nature of Christ's kingdom. Jesus predicts his death twice in Luke 9. The predictions contain very specific details. The first reveals that Jesus must suffer and die. The perpetrators are the Jewish religious leaders, and Jesus will be raised to life on the third day. The second prediction adds that Jesus will be delivered or handed over, implying the complicity of the Romans. Jesus makes a rather pointed statement. Whoever wants to be my disciple must deny themselves and take up their cross daily and follow me. Before now, no one has said anything about a cross. We know that Jesus will one day carry his crossbeam to his death by crucifixion. He could have chosen to avoid such a death, but denying his authority and prerogative, he will choose to follow the Father's will and submit to death on a cross. And now in advance, he asks us to figuratively do the same. We all have our cross to bear is a slogan sometimes heard in secular circles to mean we all go through various personal sufferings and hardships. But that is not the biblical meaning. Here it means make my will subordinate to God's. It is a basic shift of orientation as we align ourselves with God's will through a humble renunciation of our own agenda. The Apostle Paul expressed this most memorably. I have been crucified with Christ, and I no longer live, but Christ lives in me. The life I now live in the body, I live by faith in the Son of God, who loved me and gave himself for me. After the second prediction of Jesus' death, the disciples behave as if they don't get what he just said. They start arguing about which of them will be greatest in the kingdom. The self-importance thus revealed runs counter to the submission Jesus so fully endorsed. But he doesn't simply scold. He likens receiving him with receiving a child, who, in first century society, would be least in status and power. To do that requires humility, not greatness. After Jesus revealed that he must die, an event happens that is so unique and mysterious that a whole new name has to be invented to describe it. Since the King James Bible, it's been called the Transfiguration because Jesus changes not so much in substance, a transformation, but in appearance. He and his inner circle of disciples go up on a mountain, and Jesus becomes bright as lightning. Moses and Elijah appear with him. We don't know how the disciples recognize who they are, but Jesus, Moses, and Elijah have a conversation. We're not told the content of it other than it was about Jesus' departure, which we can assume means his death. It is not immediately obvious what this event represents or why it happened. Several scenarios are possible. They are not mutually exclusive. Christ's glory is revealed, and that should encourage his followers who just found out that he will be killed. The prophets are revealed, and that helps prepare Jesus for his departure, that is, his death. The Father's approval is revealed, and that should reaffirm the Son in his mission. The Father's approval echoes the Old Testament. This is my Son, Psalm 2:7, whom I have chosen, Isaiah 42:1. Listen to him, Deuteronomy 18:15. One last thought on the Transfiguration and its relationship to the Old Testament. What if it represents the changing of the guard? More specifically, it is a change of mediators. Previously, the Jews depended on the law, as represented by Moses, and the prophets, as represented by Elijah, to know the Almighty. Here in the Transfiguration, there is a formal resignation from their mediatorship before the one true mediator. That is, Moses and Elijah are handing off the baton and turning over the reins. The two forerunners had prepared the way for Jesus, and now Jesus is the fulfillment of the Old Testament. You may not have noticed, but Moses' work was completed by Joshua, which means God saves. Elijah's work was completed by Elisha, which is another name for Joshua. And ultimately, the work of both men is completed by Joshua, the Hebrew name for Jesus. One more lesson is to be learned by the disciples here. They suffer ministry failure. Now, Jesus had given them the secrets of the kingdom, the gospel, given them power over disease and demons, shown them miracle after miracle. This is all heady stuff. The temptation is to begin to rely on self and not on God. The men soon find they lack the ability to heal a demonized boy. Their ministry has to center on Jesus, not on natural abilities, self-confidence, or past successes. Christ lumps the 12 in with everyone else in a faithless and self-reliant world. For them, discipleship was sometimes 2 steps forward and 1 step back. We see this in the final segment, when an attitude of superiority and exclusivity becomes evident among the 12. Jesus puts a stop to it. Despite the setback, Luke chapter 9 marks a positive inflection point in Luke's narrative. His gospel now has new momentum and a new trajectory, and apparently that's what the author intends. The emphasis now becomes Christ's ultimate mission and the discipleship that goes with it. The 12 go from students to evangelists. Miracles start to involve increasing numbers of non-Jews. Messiah is now looking less like a national hero and more like a suffering servant. The imagery of the cross, the metaphor of cross-bearing, the repeated predictions of Christ's death, the reference to his departure in the Transfiguration, the singular focus on listening to Jesus and basing our faith in him, all these things start pointing us to Jesus' ultimate sacrifice. The saga will only get bigger from here.